But, and it's great to be here to support EcoViva and the amazing work. I'm still trying to figure out when I get to go release baby sea turtles. What was that? Okay. The talk is called Hope from the South, because Latin America is where my hope has come from, a kind of light from the South, the inspiration of great writers from Neruda and Ariel Dorfman to Subcomandante Marcos and Gioconda Belli, of the movements that look forward with the memory of the past, naming the Sandinistas after Sandino, the Zapatistas after Zapata, the FMLN after Farabundo Martí. There's an awareness that things can change dramatically for the better and for the worse, reasons for both fear and hope. Coming from a country that's been relatively stable, I see the people around me often as lacking in imagination, when imagination is where revolution begins, the ability to imagine that things could be dramatically different than they are. And of course, there's fantastic exceptions here, from Cesar Chavez to Harvey Milk to Gloria Steinem to Adrian Pu to the Richmond Green Party. But still, it can be kind of hard to rock the boat here. I decided a week after the election that I was damned if I was going to think about how to survive Trump while I could still think about stopping Trump. And yeah, like that. The election is not over yet. It just keeps entering. This is kind of like the 10th inning, or I'm bad at sports metaphors, but the legitimacy of the election and of the candidate are both open to question. The grounds for challenging a transfer of power are open. It's what I've been working on full time for the last 3 weeks, more than full time, because I already had full time work with the great organizer Taj James. And it's been interesting trying to ask people to think big enough to say, this is not inevitable. This is actually things that we are powerful. We can do things about this. We don't lie down in the road and get steamrollered. We can stand up and stop the steamroller. Maybe, possibly. And if we don't do that, the process of it is about delegitimizing the candidate and strengthening civil society en route. And indirect and incalculable consequences are one of the things I've been interested in. South and Central America have helped my imagination expand, my hope grow big, given me the capacity to imagine immense change, to imagine revolution, and to understand that hope reaches to the future but grounds itself in the past. The theologian Walter Brueggemann said a few years ago, memory produces hope in the same way that amnesia produces despair. It's an extraordinary statement, one that reminds us that though hope is about the future, the grounds for hope lie in the records and recollections of the past. And in trying to make the case for hope, I've worked for years collecting stories that remind us that sometimes we win, that change does not happen in predictable, straightforward ways. You see a lot of people who want a kind of instant results guaranteed or your money back approach to how history gets made. And of course, a lot of times the consequences are profound and the victories are within reach, but it's not immediate or direct or predictable. So hope for me is partly about coming to terms with uncertainty, with the fact that we don't know what will happen. It's grounds to try. I think of both optimism and pessimism as a kind of certainty about what will happen. And I've been subjected to horrific doses of both in the course of this election cycle. Did I mention I've been mansplained to a lot in the course of this election? I think I'll stop there. It has definitely been an erection cycle. But I've been interested because optimism is a sense that we know what will happen. Everything will be fine no matter what, so we don't have to do a damn thing. Pessimism is a sense that we're all going to hell in a handbasket and we're also completely off the hook. Hope for me, active hope, is somewhere it's a sense that we don't know what will happen and what we do might matter. And with that sense, that sort of embrace of the mystery, it's worth acting. In fact, that you must. So... And the fuel for that comes from the past. Whoever foresaw that the FMLN would take power? Okay, I know a bunch of people in this room did, but still, there were moments in the 1980s when it seemed really unlikely. Whoever thought that the three strongest politicians in South America would be women, two of whom had survived torture under the regimes of the 70s and 80s? Who thought that the murderers of Victor Jara during the coup in 73 would go on trial this year in Chile and the U.S.? Maybe organizers did. Maybe. As we enter a grim phase of American history, I've been thinking about what it meant to be, say, Nelson Mandela in the 1940s or 50s, and to commit yourself to something you would be told repeatedly was impossible, and to stay with the task for decades in prison, and to see victory at last. What made a small group of Quakers in London in the late 18th century commit to dismantling slavery in the British Empire, a task that took half a century and only one of them lived to see the completion of? What made women in the 1840s decide that women must have the right to vote, a struggle that would take 80 years? So the Zapatistas will be, on January 1st, 23 years into a revolution that reinvented revolution and inspired imaginations to open up around the world. Their appearance was one of the great surprises of contemporary history, and part of something bigger, the reversal of the erasure and dispossession of indigenous people, which is not to say that all is well now, but that there have been victories and a change in the stories we tell, and whose story is told, and who's we, and who gets to tell the stories that matter. I used to talk about hope, but when I talk about these long-term commitments, I think about faith, about doing what you do because you believe in it, even if it seems impossible or futile, or no end is in sight. And I think of what I now call a historical uncertainty principle, that we don't know what is going to happen, and if we know the historical record, we see the unexpected happening often, and we don't give in the tendency to normalize the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution in '89, or the extraordinary expansion of marriage rights is inevitable or is obvious beforehand, or something that happened for any other reason other than extraordinary work that goes all the way down to the bedrock of culture from which politics arises and up to the particulars of those politics. I think I accidentally wrote for you a kind of new set of rules for radicals. So one of which is that the world changes suddenly. I wrote a book about disasters that very much connects to Avi's film, which was wonderful and incredibly hopeful. And I wrote about 5 major disasters, but I looked at some others as well, the economic crash in Argentina in 2001, and the earthquake in Nicaragua that helped open, expose the nightmare of the Somoza regime, but also broke a lot of things free, including people's sense that everything could be different. So for the book, I interviewed Gioconda Belli, a daughter of Nicaragua's elite, a poet, and an early member of the Sandinistas. And she told me about the earthquake and saying, as the earth shakes, so does the sense of security. It is such a shock to the system, to the body, and to the sense of place, to the sense of security. All of a sudden, a lot of things you took for granted cease to be for granted, and you also realize what is important for you. What fascinated me about the earthquake was how the collective began to function as a whole. Usually it's very dispersed, and all of a sudden, the grief and the pain and the fear and all of that, it kicks in. But what I found fascinating was how people networked, and there was no higher authority. We were left to our own devices, and so we all knew we were dependent on each other, and everybody helped each other. So, and as you know, tremendous aid was sent to Nicaragua. Somoza and the army seized control of, the stuff that was donated, and seized control of assets and industries with such rapacity that even the affluent and the powerful turned on him. And he even alienated the Catholic Church. These wealthy Nicaraguans were not the ones who made the revolution, but their disaffection with Somoza after the earthquake helped open the way for it. Nor did the disaster inevitably result in a revolution. The revolutionaries themselves did the hard work of bringing it about. But the earthquake was a shift that helped. Other later events mattered. The '78 assassination of the moderate but independent newspaper editor Pedro Chamorro was a final outrage. But the shift of atmosphere came with the disaster on the night before Christmas Eve of 1972, and it lasted. Belli said to me, life is now changed back, but I think that's also what then allowed the revolution to become stronger, because really you had a sense of what was important, and people realized that what was important was freedom and being able to decide your own life and agency. We had a sense of agency in those days that we were able to decide and to do. 2 days later, you had this tyrant imposing a curfew, imposing martial law, all those kinds of things. The sense of oppression on top of the catastrophe was unbearable. And once you'd realized that your life can be decided by one night of the earth deciding to shake, you said to yourself, so what? I want to live a good life and I want to risk my life because I can also lose my life in one night. You realize that life has to be lived well or is not worth living. It's a very profound transformation that takes place during catastrophes. So now I was interested in these kind of utopian communities that often arise in catastrophe, these sort of self-determined, horizontal, participatory moments in which people overcome the disasters of everyday life, the sense of alienation, maybe of meaninglessness, of lack of voice, of lack of connection, and come together, which doesn't mean that disasters are great, but that human capacity is great, and disasters sometimes liberate it. The kind of movement that Avi documented is about how we can not be shaken awake by a disaster, but how we can wake up and stay awake and make it that way. So, and it sort of rules for radicals. Impact is not only direct, and even things pronounced failures often have indirect victories and consequences. Occupy Wall Street was repeatedly pronounced a failure as it was getting going in the fall of 2011, and then described as dead. 4 years later, people involved with local Occupies told me the thriving offshoots still make a difference. In Northern California, young people who came together for Occupy Santa Rosa continue to be involved in advocating for homeless rights and resources. An acquaintance who's one of the places where crimes and depredations are too often invisible. It mattered. And Sunday, the people there and those protesting in banks, writing letters, donating, organizing marches around the country won something worth celebrating. We're facing a lot of trouble on all fronts. Standing Rock reminds us to come together and stand up to it. So, and the last of the lessons, I think I'm running out of time, is about being slower than change, seeing these long-term changes and seeing how they happen. And you know, and those of you who are organizers know that a lot of things that look spontaneous, look spontaneous because suddenly 7,000 people showed up, but you were organizing for years to make that happen. And, our brother David, who was one of the key organizers at the WTO shutdown in Seattle, was really frustrated by people who thought that you just called in action and then magically everything blossomed. And, mushroomed. After a rain, mushrooms appear on the surface of the earth, as if from nowhere, as many see it. Many do so from a sometimes vast underground fungus that remains invisible and largely unknown. What we call mushrooms, mycologists call the fruiting body of the larger, less visible life form. Uprisings and revolutions are often considered to be spontaneous, but less visible long-term organizing and groundwork, or underground work, lay the foundation. Changes in ideas and values also result from work done by writers, scholars, public school teachers, intellectuals, social activists, and participants in social media. It seems insignificant or peripheral until very different outcomes emerge from transformed assumptions about who and what matters, who should be heard and believed, who has rights, until the doors open, until the dreams get bigger. Ideas at first considered outrageous or ridiculous or extreme gradually become what people think they've always believed. How the transformation happened is rarely remembered, in part because it's compromising. It recalls the mainstream when the mainstream was rabidly homophobic or racist, in a way it might not be now. And it recalls that power comes from the shadows and the margins, that our hope is in the dark around the edges, not the limelight of center stage, which I'd like to point out is right over there, not here. Our hope and often our power. One of my favorite writers, Ursula K. Le Guin, said a couple of years ago, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." And I want everyone to think that big. That's the work I'm doing with Stop Trump. That's the work I've been doing with Hope. That's the work I've been doing, learning from movements like Standing Rock, from these amazing things that have happened in Central America. And I want to end with a little bit from back with the Zapatistas. Marcos once wrote, "We Indian peoples have come in order to wind the clock and to thus ensure that the inclusive, tolerant, and plural tomorrow, which is, incidentally, the only tomorrow possible, will arrive," which I think we just saw a movie about. In order to do that, in order for our march to make the clock of humanity march, we Indian peoples have resorted to the art of reading what has not yet been written, because that is the dream which animates us as indigenous, as Mexicans, and above all, as human beings.